What's up, y'all? Welcome back to the Mining Pod. For this week's show, we welcome Daniel Leslie, the Chief Technology Officer of CoinSafe Limited and the Development Director at Xander and Black Labs. Daniel is a Bitcoin miner in the Down Under in Australia, and he's going to be giving us a rundown of the Bitcoin mining industry in that massive country. Now, Australia is big, but its Bitcoin mining footprint is still pretty tiny. Daniel breaks down why that is and what could potentially change in the future, and why there's a lot of promise in Australia, given that its grid is pretty similar to ERCOT. So with all of that as background, let's hop right into it. Hope you all enjoy the show.
Are you a retail or institutional investor interested in Bitcoin mining companies? The Miner Mag brings you free data and analysis from all major NASDAQ-listed Bitcoin mining operations to know who stands out. Check out visualized metrics and data-dependent stories at theminermag.com.
Today's show is brought to you by Digital Shovel. Digital Shovel is a leading manufacturer of modular mining pods as well as PDUs and switchgears. Unlike many other competitors, their product is designed and manufactured in North America with a complete UL inspection on the entire unit, not just individual components. Additionally, Digital Shovel is one of the most vertically integrated manufacturers of over 75,000 square feet of sheet metal shop, SMT and wave solder PCB assembly, as well as final assembly all under one roof in Toronto, Canada. Their price point leads the industry when compared to products with rates as low as $69,000 per megawatt for a complete data center with smart PDUs and switchgears. To learn more, visit digitalshovel.com. Daniel Leslie, welcome to the Mining Pod. How you doing, sir?
Hey, good morning / good afternoon. I think in California time, it's morning here in Brisbane. As you can see, nice sunny day. We might get a bit of rain later.
Yeah, always difficult coordinating internationally. One of the fun things and also the struggles of working in this industry, but you know, you're calling in from across multiple ponds, and we appreciate you hopping on the horn.
To be honest, I think it's nearly one really giant pond called the Pacific Ocean.
Yeah, it's just the Pacific. But anyway,
just the Pacific, right?
Just the Pacific. But appreciate you hopping on, man, and got a fun conversation ahead. We already have a lot to cover based on our preliminary discussion before we started recording. So just to set the stage, we'll start very high level. How much Bitcoin mining roughly is occurring in Australia right now, and who are the major players?
Yeah, that's an awesome question, and some of that answer is actually really hard to dig up. Partly because the Bitcoin mining is not big here in Australia, and certainly not even big compared to the global adoption at the moment on the energy grids across the world. The best estimates we can kind of get to, kind of like it's like, I know someone who knows something about someone else, is somewhere around the 100 meg mark is probably the upper limit for what's going on here in Australia. So just to give you an example, there are multiple single facilities across the world that are significantly larger than 100 megawatts. So if you take, I think it's the Riot facility in Texas is at 500 meg, I think, or 500 or 600 meg. That alone is like 5 or 6 Australia's worth of Bitcoin mining already there. So because none of the public players have a massive position here in Australia, it's really hard to, like, there's no publicly available intel for us to be like, oh yeah, we know where those things are. So again, it's kind of private players talking to each other. I've been a part of the industry since 2017. So, you eventually get around to meet everyone. And I think those that have had a position for a long time tend to be quite careful and quite quiet about what they do. And the reason being is we'll chat later on some of the problems in the Australian energy market. So if you've managed to get a really good energy contract, you kind of want to hold that tightly to your chest, right? And not let the rest of the world know what you're doing too much. So our market is small, but we'll chat further that actually the opportunity should be a hell of a lot bigger than it actually is. And there's a lot going on in the energy sector here in Australia anyway, that looking forward, I think there's some huge moves to be made.
So for the actors that are involved in this, is it mostly Australian nationals who have been in the game for a while, Also, in terms of the size of their deployments, are we talking about a couple of megawatts, 5 to 10? Is it kind of just a bunch of smaller ones, or you have a few players that might be in that 10 megawatt range?
Yeah, so what there is there's a joint venture in one Australian state called Tasmania, which is a very small island off the bottom of Australia. It's quite a big island, but has a lot of hydro farms hydro dams in Tasmania. There is a private group there, and they are by far the biggest player out there. That could be anywhere from 40 to 60 megawatts. Wow. In potential there. So that is probably half of all Australia's mining, or maybe more than half of Australia's mining in a single project. The other side of that coin is then there are a lot of these smaller farms. So, for example, myself and a team of a business I used to work for developed for a private investor a 5 megawatt site at a solar farm. That then ended up becoming a 7.5 megawatt site over time. So there are a lot of those kind of 1, 2 to 5 meg sites, kind of dotted around the place. So most of the players tend to be what you call larger private players rather than major industrial miners in that sense.
That makes sense. Yeah, for sure. And what you mentioned, Tasmania having a large hydro footprint, and that being the company that has operations there being perhaps half of the entire market in Australia. So we have the hydro in Tasmania. What are the other energy mixes that miners usually tap into? You mentioned solar for your own venture, and you mentioned, so you mentioned solar. Imagine that's a decent mix, maybe. Are most of these people hooked up to the grid? What's the mix, generally speaking?
Most of the mining tends to take the form of kind of a grid hybrid. So what usually a lot of providers are doing is they're trying to play the private grid market in terms of pricing, and that's the only way that they can really cover themselves to kind of smooth out some of the volatility in the way our market works. So our market is a very, very kind of volatile in terms of its spot price. So we do run a private grid, system that's overseen by a public regulator.
Is this kind of like ERCOT in Texas?
Exactly. So we have something here called the NEM, and then the trying to remember the name off the top of my head. The public spot market operator, NOMI, sorry, is the nomenclature for it. Exactly the same. We have a public regulator who essentially aggregates all the bids and the asks and runs essentially an exchange to balance the grid, and that sets the price up and down at every 5-minute interval of the day. There are sub-markets where there might be emergency services that are needed that private operators can bid in and out of there. So because we have this extremely renewable dense environment, it allows for it doesn't allow for a lot of flexibility when it comes to peak. And we have a massive problem with that peak period. We have all the renewables are all either off just as the load is going up, or the renewables are on when the load is going down. And so we get these long periods of negative pricing sometimes on our grid. We actually allow negative pricing. So basically the grid generators pay for the grid to take their load safely. We'll get into why some of that is later, but that we get random spikes in price. So we have this highly volatile pricing system, and so private operators are more wanting to try and play in and play out to kind of play that market a little bit. And some of the small operators do use Bitcoin mining to do that. The project that I got to work on down in South Australia, which I thought might be the beginning of a larger play actually within the grid load balancing space, they were actually connecting into the transformer at a solar farm, obviously having a direct line to the grid in there, and then they take privately from the solar farm as and when the solar is available, and then play the grid market. So they're usually off for about an hour a day, just to hedge that price at the peak period of time. But then they can take the off-peak, and then they can also pull in from the grid ever so slightly during negative periods of the day, building up a bit of a credit. So combined, they can average, almost like dollar cost average every day, their cost of energy lower and lower and lower across time, as long as they're willing to be a flexible load on the grid. So in general, most of these smaller projects that we see in the Australian space really are kind of based around that. There's a few companies who have gone really far down the road of this and actually built whole businesses, not as Bitcoin miners, but as grid auxiliary service companies, where they take the load off the grid at a static rate and then get paid by the NEM to turn off, when it's needed, to demand response, to curtail their load, and provide the grid with those kind of ulterior services. They get paid to be on standby. They get paid to do all kinds of other things like frequency modulation. So they're slightly different in terms of businesses. They're not just trying to hunt for Bitcoin. They are trying to play energy games and use the energy market that we have here in Australia to their effect. So I would say a good bucket, probably 30% of all projects, maybe sit in there, either intentionally or unintentionally, just for being the best. Just to actually be the best. Get the best cost of energy that they can moving forward.
They're almost like energy traders more than Bitcoin miners at that point, right? I mean, that's kind of the approach they would be taking.
100%. And I mean, that kind of blows the whole, conversation wide open. What is Bitcoin mining actually? Of course, we know that it's network security to the Bitcoin network. But is it actually just energy arbitrage? Is that what we're really in the game? And I think it's good for large miners to really start to have that energy first approach, and start to really think from that top line perspective. You will open the doors, and I know a lot of people in this space are already doing a great job in this area. It will open the doors a lot more to the traditional energy markets for them, understanding that we're just a buyer of last resort rather than trying to teach them about this beautiful new world called Bitcoin. So
big players in Bitcoin mining demand stability, regulation, and trust. That's why NiceHash has moved its headquarters to Switzerland, a country known for its strong regulatory framework and for keeping its cheese locked in a safe. As one of the most regulated mining platforms in the industry, NiceHash provides institutional miners with a secure, compliant, and transparent solution to manage and maximize their mining output, delivering the reliability and performance expected from the best mining tools, along with firmware, monitoring software, and other essential mining tools. Contact a NiceHash representative today to learn why the top Bitcoin miners are making the switch to NiceHash. You can find out more info in today's show notes. And when you contact them, let them know the Mining Pod sent you.
I want to zoom in on the kind of grid pricing and stability that you just touched on in Australia. And I have a few data points here. So Australia, depending on who you ask, has anywhere from 35 to 39% renewable penetration. Of this renewable penetration, according to the Clean Energy Council, a report for 2024, 13.4% is wind, 11.2% is rooftop solar, 7% is large-scale solar. As we've seen this in Texas too, obviously, as the grid has had more renewable penetration and they haven't built out base load, Texas has had the same kind of duck curve problems where you would see energy prices go negative at certain points during the day and then spike when the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining. Has that kind of electricity stability hindered growth for Australia? Or to say it another way, I should say price instability as well. Has that hindered the growth of the Bitcoin mining industry in Australia?
Look, it is probably contributed to about 99% of the hindrance of the growth has been that price volatility. Because on the face of it, we have a fantastic natural resource. We've got some low-lying mountains with very easy access to our major cities. We have, which would be great for development of hydro projects. Obviously, we have a lot of coal, a lot of gas, although we do want to move away from those. I think the narrative is very clear globally. We mine 30%, depending who you ask, of all the world's uranium. So we have huge nuclear resources internally. And then on the other side of it, we've spent 20 years now building out large wind, large solar in copious amounts. So all of this combined, it's really been an issue of our policy has just centered on coal generation being the enemy and how quickly we can get rid of coal. And so there's been a lot of push politically, without going down a whole political rabbit hole or trying to open the climate debate or anything like that. The truth of the matter is our energy markets have been massively affected by the concerted effort to make coal absolutely unsustainable to generate. So the energy regulator mandates a carbon neutral first process. So for example, if there is a lot of solar and a lot of wind on our energy grid, then it mandates that the large coal power plants have to de-energize. So they can't be producing coal as a base. They can't be running their turbines at base load to provide for the grid. They have to turn off to make space for the renewable load. So what that causes is massive problems come peak period when all the renewable, well, the thing about solar is we can guarantee that it's going to be off for at least 12 hours a day. We know that it's going to start to decay pretty rapidly from about 4 p.m. through to 6 p.m., which is just when the load wants to peak, obviously. So you're getting these old legacy systems that were never meant to be turned off. They were meant to run as smoothly and as stably possible, gently up and gently down through the day, providing that grid stability, providing the rotating momentum, the rotating mass in our grid system, and they're being turned off and turned on like gas peaker plants, and they're not surviving. So that's driving up the cost during the peak period for our coal power plants, which has the knock-on effect of there not being enough generation to take up that demand, because if coal power plants can't make money, then they close down more quickly. And that's the theory that's being pushed, is like, well, we'll make them close down due to economic factors rather than regulation factors. The negative side of that is then that it's put these ludicrously strange peaks, like you were saying, in Texas. What hasn't happened is we haven't had the transitional step that Texas had made probably 15 years ago into the gas, generation, and being willing to allow gas to take over the coal. There are several attempts at building out some kind of interim steps. We're looking at things like pumped hydro. We're trying to rejuvenate and maybe put on some more hydro projects. Although being a first world developed economy, our environmental regulation is quite difficult, and it's quite it can be pretty onerous in regards to getting new projects off the ground. However, that really kind of hinders a lot of these energy companies from being able to offer, the retail market, and then their large, industrial customers, where Bitcoin mining would usually fall, being a large industrial user. It kind of hinders them from being able to offer genuinely good energy contracts, because they want to be very cautious about their base load. The base load element is getting that part of the pie is getting smaller and smaller and smaller every year, and they want to, a lot of those contracts have to be really, really clear, really, really committed to capacity for their clients. So that has really hindered the development of Bitcoin mining here, because it means that just the average cost of energy has crept up and crept up and crept up over the last 10 years.
Yeah, I was about to ask. It's like at that point, miners don't even they have to go to the margins or on the fringe somewhere, and they have to find opportunities like you mentioned in solar, or maybe at a high, like you said, hydro in Tasmania. But if you're operating under a normal grid situation in Australia, you wouldn't be able to hack it because that cost of energy would just be too high based on what you're describing. You saw me kind of like my mouth was agape when you were describing this. So am I understanding it correctly that if I guess to boil it down to the simplest terms, you have 100 megawatt coal plant, you have 100 megawatts of solar and wind nameplate capacity. If that 100 megawatts of solar and wind nameplate is operating, you have 150 megawatts of demand on both of those assets. They're going to tell the coal plant to go down to 50 megawatts until there's a shortfall from that. So it's like you never even have the baseload operating at 100% capacity.
Yeah. And that has been the crux of the issue. And I know some people very, very well in the coal power plant generation, and they want to turn them off because they're becoming too expensive to run. I mean, coal can operate at very, very, very low cost to generate once it's up and running. Once the momentum's there, it's just keeping your thermal, the thermal energy in your boilers high, and the momentum in your generators high, and it's just adjusting things around the edges. They were never meant to be dialed all the way down and dialed all the way up. And if you know anything about heating and cooling, that's how you break things, and that's how you break things really quickly.
Right.
So we've had this we've kind of had this mass exodus of coal because of environmental policy. And the other side of the thing is, if you look at the Texas duck curve situation, we run a much more, call it, government top-down incentivized system for renewable energy than even Texas or even the US government does. So we provide what are called green energy certificates. So large energy users need to purchase certain offsets for their energy. So they need to know that if they use energy that didn't come from green sources, they need to cover that with a megawatt hour generated somewhere on the grid of green energy, as this kind of incentive structure to build more, to build more renewables. So those are called, they're called large green energy certificates, LGCs, large green certificates, and they trade somewhere between $30 a megawatt hour. This is Australian, so consider it $20 a megawatt hour US and $40 a megawatt hour US. And so what happens is that solar farms get paid those or get certified those by the government for just generating and pushing onto the grid. So there's an incentive for them to continue to push onto the grid, even if the grid price is negative, because at least down to the level of their green energy certificate sale price, because they're still generating money. And so what you then have is you have a situation where there's way too much load on the grid, and the grid is having to slam breakers, dump load. We're getting kind of transformers and thermal load banks with, design lives of 40 years, 60 years, needing to be replaced in 10 years, in 20 years, because the load on those things is in the wrong direction. It was never meant to be used constantly. It was meant to be the, the airbag for the grid when there was a hard problem. And those hard problems were supposed to be once a year, twice a year, maybe in a cyclone
event. Now that airbag is getting deployed every single day.
Every day, sometimes multiple times a day. And
wow.
So that also drives up grid costs. That means the cost of transmission has gone up, dramatically as well. So these just sound like all big red flags, right?
Well, they sound like red flags, but you're also highlighting the case in which Bitcoin miners could come in and act as energy sponges when things are being overproduced, right? And you don't want to just flush the grid with a bunch of power that it can't consume, right? I mean, I assume that's where they would come in, right? You just throw miners down on these solar farms and they soak up the excess when they can't sell directly to the grid.
100%.
But then is there another problem there where they don't get these renewable energy credits if they're selling on site? Do they have to go to the grid with it? Like, is there an incentive there where the solar operators say, well, we're not going to get this money if we don't push it to the grid?
Yeah. So again, this is one of these, perverse incentives at the moment. There is a little bit of that going on. So in some ways, the play for a Bitcoin miner really has to be actually sitting on grid rather than what you'd think is behind the meter transaction. Now, some of this is changing because you're getting a lot of pushback from the grid operators on the government, on the regulator to say this has to stop. You're killing us. You're breaking our incentives. You're breaking our ability to manage the load. We're creating sometimes there's mini blackouts that are almost unheard of, right? In a first world developed country. They don't happen regularly, and that's kind of through to the titanic efforts of the people that actually do manage this demand on a daily basis. And they're trying lots of different things, like trying to create these what they call demand response customers or frequency response customers to try and help stabilize this. So the opportunity is really now working out the actual partnerships with the grid operators and operating on their incentives, because their incentives are simply to keep the grid stable and letting it flow. And I mean, I meet these people and try and have at least a few conversations a quarter. Previously, and I'm talking through 2020, 2021, 2022, the answer was just no. They weren't interested. They couldn't sell to us. They didn't was. There's bad incentives. All the stuff. It's Bitcoin. We can't sell to crypto companies. All of those incentives. Just recently, in the last 12 months, and I think we have the US to thank for this. The change in leadership in the US has really transformed the discussion, I believe. There is an openness now to seek solutions and seek all solutions, all options becoming on the table. So at a grid operator level, there is the potential to kind of mitigate some of those perverse incentives by being directly behind the grid, behind the meter per se on a solar farm. Because yes, you're right. They get paid regardless if it was useful or not.
So these conversations are starting to happen. Where would you say they are at this point? I mean, obviously still in the early stages, but I mean, you're pretty hopeful that the officials and some of the grid operators are actually seriously looking at Bitcoin mining as a solution. And if they are, what kind of business structures do you think will come of this? Do you think they'll do JVs with mining companies? Do you think they'll just try to do it themselves? How do you kind of see this evolving?
I think actively they're looking at JVs with mining companies. So again, kind of being in a strange privileged position where I'm kind of the guy that most people know in Bitcoin mining, and there is this real attitude of openness in the grid operators, and then even some of the larger generators now, to really look very, very seriously at Bitcoin miners purely as that buyer of last resort for their energy. Because they can see the way the legislation is working, they can see the incentive structure, and also, an announcement by the opposition government, the opposition party here in Australia, we have an election this year. They've announced that they would like to put nuclear on our grid, and they want to build one plant in every state is their current plan. It's probable that they will actually win the next election. So there's now this incentive where baseload might come back over the next 5-10 years. We've got all this renewable infrastructure here, there, and everywhere, and all the the transmission lines that we've built out over the last 20 years to support that. And yet baseload might just come back in and solve all these problems. So what are we going to do? And I think that's putting some real urgency. So the discussion, for example, I'm privileged to be involved in some discussions with some very, very large solar and wind farm operator developer companies. So they both develop and operate. And they are looking at Bitcoin mining even just to create a base load. And they will work out the other grid incentives for them to be able to provide, call it a 95, 96, 97% uptime. To give them, even if it's not half their capacity or 100%, even if it's just 10% of their installed capacity, creating a monetary backstop for their projects. There's some other projects around dealing with creating the minimum possible load on transmission. So you ideally need a load at one end and a load at other, so that the energy flows from a generator to the load rather than vice versa. You don't want reverse currents and things like that. So again, these energy operators are looking at opportunities where there would have been a net cost to their business and looking to partner with, literally joint venture with mining companies or anyone who is willing to buy the energy that would be available to provide that service, rather than blowing the air brake the airbag constantly, as we use that analogy. Is like, well, why don't we at least have an airbag that pays us if we're gonna have that on a constant basis? So these are, well, I mean, some of these are starting to approach contract stage now. So maybe this is me being the Cassandra in the coal mine, saying that the waterfall is coming. We're starting to see the music change out here in Australia, and the top line statistics. Let me just kind of give you them. Is that we've nearly 80%, so 79% of all the installed capacity, the theoretical maximum amount of renewables that we could generate, 79% of it either gets curtailed or never generated at all, which is an extraordinary sum.
Crazy.
Which is an extraordinary sum. So we have these massive assets sitting here doing nothing most of the time. The goodness of the government in terms of being able to print these green energy certificates for operators is slowing down, and it's becoming a lot harder to get a grid connection. The licensing is taking a lot longer. There are more and more of these stranded energy projects. There are more and more solar farms and wind farms that are now 2 years, 3 years, 4 years behind on their monetization schedules, and they're looking for options and they're looking for opportunities. And it's almost like the partnership, the partnership approach rather than a direct customer approach is definitely how the early stages of this is going to be. Working out something that works in the financial interest of a counterparty that you're working with, and Bitcoin mining has a huge opportunity to sell to these energy providers and these energy players.
Yeah, so it sounds like two opportunities potentially in the future. If the nuclear stuff does end up happening, then there's an opportunity to soak up some of that base load when it's not being consumed. That's obviously super attractive, I would say, for a nuclear operator, because those projects are super expensive. Obviously, Great energy, big fan of nuclear myself, but incredibly CapEx intensive. Once you get it up and running, you want to be selling as much of that as possible to pay back a plant like that. And then obviously as well, the other side of this is what we were just talking about earlier about, in the meantime, those renewables projects are primed for having a Bitcoin miner to consume some of that otherwise curtailed load.
In the competitive world of Bitcoin mining, one name stands out: CleanSpark, America's Bitcoin miner. At CleanSpark, efficiency isn't just a goal, it's our standard. Our sophisticated facilities are built and led by expert teams who care about Bitcoin and the communities we work in. Scale, we've mastered it. Our large-scale operations have set us apart in the industry as examples of community-oriented building. Our track record speaks for itself. We navigate the complexities of the new economy with precision and with skill, continuously achieving operational milestones. Curious about how we do it? We invite you to discover the story behind CleanSpark's success at cleanspark.com.
You mentioned that the approval process is taking longer now. Is that just because officials are looking at the dollars and cents of this and realizing that it's kind of the incentives are just messing up the grid?
Yeah, and ultimately, it's the grid operators who have to sign off on the safety and the efficacy of these systems. So rather than obviously try and change legislation at the moment, grid operators are kind of solving the problem with the regulatory powers they've been given. So it's kind of like, if you won't change the incentives, we'll break the incentives, that are currently there. So again, you're having a lot of these just to get your grid connection approval at a renewable site is taking longer and longer. I mean, it used to go from 3 to 6 months when there was a big boom in this, 5 years ago, to now a year, 2 years. There's some of these major projects that have been waiting 3 years. So they're technically islanded. Yes, they have all the hardware, all the physical connections, all the interconnect, all the engineering is done, but they can't generate energy because it's pre-demand. And we at the moment, we don't have a good idea of how much that is. But that could be, several thousand megawatts of installed capacity. That's in that state at the moment. So again, those are huge opportunities, because right now you're a buyer of last resort. You say, well, we'll just turn it on for us. Give us as much energy as you can. If you're a Bitcoin miner, it just is a price calculation. I always say, this when it comes to Bitcoin mining, there's no such thing as bad energy. There's just a bad price for that energy. If energy is available 20% of the day, don't pay 10 cents a kilowatt hour for it. But if it's only available 20% of the day, there is probably a price at which it might be worth. There is a model that meets that kind of profile. And so those, for the more creative of Bitcoin miners, who are willing to take an energy first approach, there is massive, opportunities. Maybe this is me kind of like opening the door and saying, please come, bring all your engineering, your expertise, your experience and your capital. Australia is a great place, as I think, we may have said previously, Australia is a great place to do business, particularly for people from North America and Europe, in terms of overseas investment. We've got a legal system that is, we were saying there in our pre-briefing, is kind of like a combination between the British system and the American system. We have states, and then we also have a federal government. However, we have a British common law system here in Australia because we were a British colony for many years. We didn't have a revolution. We kind of got gifted it, so we didn't need one. So that's led to a very, very similar attitude of trust, of we have incredibly safe and secure institutions. It's actually, it's so fascinating. Like our exchange, just to talk the general crypto market here, our exchange infrastructure in Australia has really blossomed in the past, full Bitcoin cycle. Our regulators kind of got onto the potential of an FTX type event happening, like very, very, very early on. And they put in place some really, really good rules a long time ago about collateralization, about safety, and about, customer service. And so it's not too regulation heavy at the moment. We don't have formal regulation, but even the business code related to crypto exchanges is really heavy. I work very closely with a crypto exchange here and have for many years called CoinStash. So I get to kind of see the inside of how that market works. And there's a ton of foreigners, foreign companies, American businesses actually wanting to do their exchange here in Australia for the safety and the regulation of what's going on. So they hold their assets here in Australia. It's great, kind of creates a nice tax efficient structure. So we're kind of already at the top of the industry, the investment case, for Bitcoin, the investment case for crypto. Australian businesses are already taking up that charge. And so now the next natural progression I see is our abundant energy resources starting to receive the same kind of attention. So you've got two things that are really going very, very well. Like the call it the micro success story of the JV in Tasmania. And I think you even informed me today is actually two American companies that came and if Tether can also be considered an American company these days, but mainly an American-based team, that came and bought that capacity up, probably for a lot of the reasons we're talking about. A very, very secure legal system. Ultimately, you can sue people and get your money back. I mean, that's ultimately
right.
what it's about here. And then the other side, where we have extremely liquid and extremely secure crypto markets on that side. So we've almost now got that third point, which is, hey, there's an energy opportunity here. And for those miners that are looking for an energy first approach, that are looking to do things like we've seen in Texas. I mean, I think the Texas model is like waiting to happen. That's kind of the dirty secret of all of this. Texas had all of our problems, 10 years ago in the ERCOT, large distances between major populations, a lot of over production of renewable energy, dwindling base load. They had a lot of gas fields and oil fields with stranded energy on them that was just being burned off. And we have all of those features here in Australia. Maybe our distances are bigger. Maybe our overproduction of renewables has gone even more to an extreme because we've had 10 more years of what I describe as malinvestment. But as we've seen in the Texas case, it didn't take much for the floodgates to open there and for the opportunities to really get bought up very, very quickly once people learned how to utilize them.
Yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned Texas. All the pieces are in place for Australia to mimic the Texas model with regards to integrating Bitcoin mining into its grid.
Yeah.
Why has that not happened yet? I know we talked about the fact that prices are unstable, so you would not necessarily see Bitcoin miners deploying en masse for, a PPA or a market rate. But I'm curious why you haven't seen more miners integrating with renewables projects or like adding, buyer of a last resort for renewables based load, like we've seen in West Texas, which has a high penetration of solar and wind. So why has that, what's been kind of preventing that adoption?
Well, look, I'm going to answer that kind of in probably on three different fronts. I think that the first step is call it regulation and red tape on a first level. A lot, and I don't know why, but a lot of these large scale renewable projects actually got funded with early days with provisos that they do not sell their energy to Bitcoin miners. So I would often in 2018, 2019, 2020, even into 2021, start talking with, large energy generators, and they're so keen, and you start to develop a price and you start to mix grid and renewables together, and then they get on and then they discover you're a Bitcoin miner, after the second or third conversation that you're going to use it for crypto mining, and they're like, oh, sorry, we got our funding based on you not doing that. And so without getting conspiratorial, it could be large money, large banking, discriminating against crypto companies. It could be just, the superannuation industry out here, our pension industry. You think about that in the US context. Didn't like crypto for a very, very long time. That's changing quickly. So a lot of those legacy funding from kind of 5 to 7 years ago actually had red tape saying do not sell to crypto miners. So that's kind of where we've come from here in Australia. Because of that, I think that pushed a lot of the interest away internationally. So then you go to a market-based approach. There have been a lot easier opportunities. I mean, again, the company that I'm a co-founder and a CTO in, we just looked overseas and we looked at the UAE. We looked at how to make relationships there. Bada bing, bada boom. Multi-megawatt scale, 24 hours a day, small curtailment over a summer period for about 3 hours. Like there's easy. We don't have to think and engineer and structure those opportunities. So I think it's been the abundance of a lot of other better opportunities, and particularly if you think kind of on a holistic level, globally in the Bitcoin mining industry, we've had Ethiopia absolutely going off, and we've had Paraguay absolutely going off. So for this last cycle, you've just had a ton of attention and a ton of investment in massive hydro, abundantly available, very cheap, buy. So on a macro level, I would say then you've had other better opportunities. And the third one, realistically, is a lack, again, not for a lack of trying, but a lack of education in the energy space. And I might even add to that a lack of imagination, where you've had these large energy providers who have done business very successfully for 60, 70, 80, 90 years in a very traditional way, who haven't had the forward, impetus to have to change their business models. And now, because of the way and the incentive structures that have been created over the last 20 years here in Australia, they're having to look differently. So look, sometimes it's better to be, early than never. I think there's probably been a few super early, movers in this space who have started the approach of like, how can we work with, these energy companies? And energy companies are finally waking up to the fact that we exist, that there are opportunities to monetize their stranded energy, that they can look for better ways of selling their energy than just trying to find a grid customer and trying to find the highest price on the grid.
So do you think now that you're seeing more interest from these grid operators, will those red tape provisions be dropped? Like, are you already seeing that? Do you think that will just naturally fall to the wayside?
Oh yeah, and I have to, I have to give a lot of honor to to people who have worked very, very hard, particularly in the Texas grid, in the ERCOT, a lot of the large companies, and how Texas has become Bitcoin mining mecca. I spoke with someone who was a senior engineer and a grid operator, one of our local grid, our state grid operators. He'd decided to take a year off, traveled the world. He traveled to Texas, and then I caught up with him at a crypto conference, of all places. And he'd been to Texas, and his mindset had been totally transformed. And so it's like he's gone, he's seen, he's witnessed what is possible when you think about adding an on-demand energy customer who can give the energy back at any moment. And obviously he came back super excited and wanting to work out things. Now, obviously he'd left his position and, is kind of, looking to reintegrate. But that kind of story is starting to happen out here. And I think it's just a matter of time before the leaders within that space really begin to take up the opportunity and begin to really take up the thinking. Globally, I think about it for Bitcoin miners as well, because look, again, I'm a Bitcoin miner myself. I do it personally. I have co-founded businesses. I tell people, I don't tell them what I do. I just say, look, I am put on earth to monetize energy. That is my calling in life, for better or for worse. I have this beautiful tool called Bitcoin mining to do it, and that's just what I do. So I have to think about our incentives as well. What's our incentives? Well, our incentives are actually about longevity. So if we see what's happening in Paraguay, how quickly did the price go from under 1 cent through to north of 5 cents on their grid, as miners began to move in mass? You can still find small private deals out there if you do work with the government out there to maybe build out infrastructure. You can get under that 5 cent mark. But the opportunity in 24 months went from sub 1 cent to over 5 cents on grid. And so we see that starting to happen in Ethiopia. It won't take long. It's probably got a little bit more, leeway to run out there. We're already seeing it in the UAE, for example, where we work. There's a massive project in Oman. In fact, I think a mutual connection of ours, and he's a shy guy, and I want to give him a shout out because he's great. Jonathan Yonkers from Bitmain sent me these amazing photos of this project he's working on out in Oman in the Middle East, and I think their cost of power, it's a 400 meg site, or will be a 400 meg site when completed, but their cost of power is 4.1 cents USD, which for a very, very large site is good. It's available, but it's definitely not the best, and it's not as good as some of these opportunities have been. So here's my, I suppose, my pitch to other Bitcoin miners and miners like me. We are going to have to find a lower cost of energy over time. That's the longevity and the duration of our business, is to scour the earth for how we can make energy cheaper and make it more abundantly, because that's how our business rolls. Bitcoin gets like twice as difficult to mine once every 4 years. We can guarantee it. We can absolutely guarantee it. It's mathematically locked in, and it's never changing anytime soon. So either our return structure is going to halve, and we're going to become a very much less profitable business, or as an industry, we are going to lead the charge in energy innovation. And so that's why I think now is a really good time for a lot of Bitcoin miners to take this energy first approach, even globally. I mean, move in the countries and the economies that you're comfortable with, and you've got safety and security first. But we are going to have to find ways of taking advantage of more complex opportunities, rather than just go find the best PPA we can, fill it with as many megawatts as we can, and just sit there, online 24/7, 365. I think that model, as I look at it over the next 10 years, is going to decay, and we're going to see an uplift in these variable models where we have to cooperate with the energy industry, and we almost become part of the energy infrastructure over time.
It makes sense to me. I think we're obviously, to your point, already kind of seeing the industry trend that way. But I think we'll leave it there. That was a great way to cap off the conversation. Daniel, thank you so much for joining, man. Tell our listeners and viewers where they can find out more about your work and the companies that you're involved with.
No, that's awesome. So look, the easiest place to find me is on LinkedIn. I try and make myself out to be a try-hard LinkedIn influencer. I'm just available if you search Daniel Leslie, Bitcoin mining. I will come up on there. If anyone wants to contact me via email, I'm daniel@zanderandblack.com. Always feel free to reach out there. And the other side of it is I do a lot of, different things in the space in terms of like speaking. So sometimes I might be at a conference you might be going to. Please come and say hi. I love talking to Bitcoin miners. I love hearing their problems. I'm one myself. I know your pain, and also I know your joy as well when everything goes working. So thank you so much for the conversation, mate. It's a real joy to talk to someone who understands.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. Really appreciate you joining, and to all of our viewers and listeners, appreciate y'all. We'll see you next week.